Happy June 30th, everybody. Or, well, July 1st, because I upload things late. Today was absolutely insane. Supreme Court finished up their stuff. They handed out two major rulings. But also, I found something out about Iowa that you're going to want to know. Are they trying to stronghold third party candidates out of elections? Or are they being honest and fair with their technicalities? But first, the Supreme Court. Now, in a 6-3 decision involving Executive Order 14160, the Supreme Court has ruled that the president may not rewrite an amendment in the Constitution, not even with a Sharpie. Constitutions do not go through executive action, therefore they cannot be changed through executive action. Secondly, transgender sports. Now I want to preface, I usually stay out of transgender politics because, well, I am transgender. However, transgender people make up roughly 1% of the population, yet somehow we seem to occupy half of America's political conversations. Personally, I'd rather see people spend more time understanding gender dysphoria and having honest discussions than using us as campaign talking points. But since the Supreme Court ruled on this today, let's talk about it. Supreme Court ruled that states have the authority to ban transgender athletes from competing in women's sports. Notice what I just said, though. States, not the federal government. That distinction matters. States' rights matter. I've already seen people, to include congressional candidate Reed Reisner, claim that this amounts to a nationwide federal ban. But I mean, come on. We're talking about Reed Reisner here. Trans people don't live just rent-free inside of his head. We straight up have a lease with the option to buy. But this isn't what today's ruling says. Whether people didn't read the opinion or are intentionally misrepresenting it, the outcome is the same, and voters should not be misinformed. But if you're running for Congress, reading the actual opinion before commenting on it should be the bare minimum. If you can't read the bare minimum, then where is your merit, Reed? As for me, I personally like how things are run through the PGA and the LPGA with eligibility. If someone has experienced male puberty, they can only compete in the PGA. If they did not, then they can compete in either league. People are free to disagree with this standard. I am simply one person, and they are simply the Supreme Court, which means they interpret the Constitution and the supreme law of the land. But now, this is what today's topic is about: Iowa. This story really caught my attention because it affects libertarians. 3 libertarian candidates have now been removed from Iowa ballots. Not for fraud, not for criminal conduct, not for failing to qualify, but for paperwork. Let me read that again. Not for fraud. We have candidates running in both parties that have been found to have fraud. We have candidates that have both engaged in criminal conduct, and we have candidates who have had to be removed for not actually qualifying in both major parties. But libertarians are being removed for paperwork purposes. And these paperwork purposes, they seem a little sketchy. So, for Eddie Gluba and Nicole Cutler, the Republican challenge claimed the ticket had a technical filing error. One involved Gluba's address allegedly misspelling his street name. But the bigger issue involved Lieutenant Governor candidate Nicole Cutler. According to Cutler's testimony, she brought her affidavit of candidacy to election officials before the filing deadline. She says an election clerk told her Lieutenant Governor candidates don't need to file that form and turned her away. After the hearing, the same clerk testified she couldn't remember that interaction. Cutler even produced a copy of the affidavit she attempted to submit. Despite this testimony, the all-Republican panel unanimously voted to remove both candidates from the ballot because the affidavit wasn't officially filed. The next congressional candidate, Marco Bettiglia. The challenge: his legal birth name is Mark Thomas Anderson, but he has publicly gone by Marco Tommaso Battaglia since 2009. He's used that name through his heavy metal band, his podcast, and throughout his public life. But apparently this is a problem. But the interesting part is his name's already appeared on 4 previous Iowa ballots under the name Marco Battaglia, and nobody objected. But this time, the panel voted 2-1 to remove him. The lone vote to not remove him was through the Democratic member, arguing that forcing him to use his legal name would actually confuse voters because they know him as Marco. However, the Republican Party disagreed. Then they tried it again with Rick Stewart, because Richard is his legal name, not Rick. However, this time the panel rejected the challenge. They ruled that Rick is simply a common shortening of Richard and wouldn't confuse voters. So apparently, Rick instead of Richard is fine, perfectly acceptable, but Marco, which has been used for years instead of Mark, even after years of public use, and 4 previous elections, not acceptable. That's a distinction a lot of people are going to question. Look, libertarians are no strangers to being treated as the third wheel of American politics. The Democrats and the Republicans have been around for well over a century. The Libertarian Party's still young, so young that some of the original members are still alive today. And to be fair, the Libertarian Party doesn't usually jump straight to alleging to foul play. But these rulings, they kind of deserve scrutiny. When candidates are removed because they followed instructions from election officials, when someone who has appeared on previous ballots under the same name is suddenly disqualified, and then another candidate using a shorthand version of his legal name is allowed to stay on the same ballot, we're naturally going to ask whether the rules are being applied consistently. But this also brings up a question. What happens if J.D. Vance runs in 2028? What if he runs for the presidency? Is Iowa going to just say, nope, J.D. Vance cannot be on the ballot? Or are they going to waive that same exact disqualification and say, you know what, this time we're going to allow it. This time it's fine. Look, I'm not going to tell you that this proves corruption. But what I am going to tell you is it's raising questions. There's been gerrymander wars, but Iowa can't gerrymander. However, that doesn't mean they can't purposely try to sabotage. Do I think they'd try to sabotage? Not necessarily. But it's starting to look a little bit like that. Anyways, that's what I've got for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Let's see if I can find anything to go on tomorrow on this. But hopefully they can get things figured out in Iowa. And I am kind of curious. Iowa, if you're watching this, are you going to allow J.D. Vance to be on the ballot in 2028 if he runs for president? Even though J.D. Vance is not his actual name.